can speak and try to look at all the names here on the board. I thank Helen and Antje for this occasion, and it's great that we're having this course within EuMIGS. I was one of the people who helped set it up together with the colleagues around Europe, so it's great to join this course with everyone. So what I'm going to do here today, I'm going to start to share some slides. In fact, quite a few slides, and I hope this will work now and that you will see my slides here. I'm going to speak about this book, which is now about 10 years old. And I would like us today to, this is a historical work on European integration and colonialism. But I would like us to do something after I've talked, and that is to try to relate it and what I'm saying, and also the readings that I hope most of you have done for this seminar and lecture, to relate it to these readings. It is a book that I wrote with my colleague P.O. Hansen, and so it's a joint work, co-authored. And I would like to, before I go into this historical material, I would like to give you a couple of quotes, which are now about 10 years old, but I think they retain their validity, and they point to a general contradiction within the European Union migration politics and policy. So I will read this. Between 2010 and 2030, at current immigration flows, the decline in the EU's working age population will entail a fall in the number of employed people of some 20 million. Such developments will have a huge impact on overall economic growth, the functioning of the internal market, and the competitiveness of EU enterprises. In this context, more sustained immigration flows could increasingly be required to meet the needs of the EU labour market and ensure Europe's prosperity. This is the European Commission's Green Paper on how to manage economic migration. And then a statement from around the same time by the International Center for Migration Policy Development in Vienna. Between 1993 and 2003, more than 10,000 migrants and refugees died in and around the Mediterranean while trying to reach the EU, many of them in search of work. And as we know, many of them who died, they came from Africa, and they continue to die in efforts to reach Europe and make a future there. So on the one hand, Europe needs migrants. On the other hand, Europe does not want migrants, and particularly not those migrants who come from what we can largely call the global south. I'm not going to go into the reasons, the contradictions, the conflicts that surrounds this problem and this contradiction, which all the nation states of the European Union and the European Union itself is struggling with in more or less fruitful and prudent ways. But I'm going to go to a little bit of a background that will help us understand this issue. And here I draw on the material that we have used for this book, Eurafrica. And I want to go back to the moment when Africans became an issue for the first time in the early 20th century in Europe. Because arguably the first major European debate on importation of African labor and service erupted during World War I. It was a time when thousands of soldiers born in the colonies of all the European states were fighting on European territory for the French and the British sides. So here are some cuirassiers and from Senegal in Europe. This is a painting of Senegalese troops in Europe. This is a photograph of what these troops that fought in World War I looked like. And here we have some other guys who were fighting in Europe about 110 years ago. Now, these troops, they ignited an intense debate in all European countries. Because what happened was that, and particularly in Germany, and as Germany was later toward the end of the war and after the end of the war occupied by French troops, German newspapers were flooded by articles with rumors of all the alleged atrocities that were committed by these black and Arab troops on the white European population. These troops were from Madagascar, French Equatorial and West Africa, Morocco, Algeria, and they patrolled the streets of the occupied territories of Germany. As German president of the time said, the deployment of colored troops of the most inferior culture as overseers of a population of such high spiritual and economic importance as the Rhinelanders. This is an intolerable violation of the law of European civilization, unquote. For Adolf Hitler, he spoke of the colonial troops, and this was in his work Mein Kampf. He said that it was, he spoke about them in terms of the contamination by N blood on the Rhine in the heart of Europe, bastardizing the European continent at its core. And Hitler here was in good company, because these opinions, they reached deep into the general opinions in Western Europe's liberal and social democratic establishment, as well as into prominent women's organizations. So the deployment here of blacks on white soil, if we can put it that way, was a subject of high diplomatic contention. And Germany demanded that France should restrict the visibility of Africans in the occupied territories. And this is why I think World War I and its aftermath merit attention, because it's the first time that European politicians and diplomats negotiate on how to limit the number of Africans in Europe, while at the same time, of course, recognizing that these Africans were needed in Europe as soldiers who were fighting on the sides of the European countries and empires. This was called the Black Horror in Britain. It was called La Honte Noire, and in Germany it was called the Schwarze Schande and other adjectives. And These are some other quite gross and awful caricatures that mark public opinion of the presence. This is a caricature of a French black soldier trampling the houses in a small German village and clamping white female bodies against his body. This one that I will show you now, it's another quite upsetting picture, but it's a memorial coin that was printed in Germany. You see here, Die Wacht am Rhein. It says on one side of the memorial coin from 1920. It says Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité. And then you see a French soldier, a French African soldier. And then on the other side of the coin, you see Die schwarze Schande, the black scandal, the black, yes. And then you see again a white woman tied to the trunk of a tree, which eventually turns out to be a erected penis. So I'm showing you these because this is how Africans were perceived 100 years ago in Europe. Africans that were brought to Europe to fight there as soldiers. And it is interesting that this debate concerned precisely the area of Europe that is at the origins of the European Union. The so-called area between the area between Belgium, Germany, and France. And here you can see the occupied areas that was concerned. And it is in this area which we can also place the origin of European integration and of the European Union itself, because it was in order to manage this area peacefully half a century later that the European coal and steel community came into being. A project launched by French Foreign Minister Schuman, who is seen as one of the founders of the European Union, a union regarding the production of European coal and steel and the common market for European coal and steel, which is at the origin of the European Common Market or today's European Union. Because one of the conclusions that was drawn by European politicians of the period was regarding that the struggle over this area that you see in this map had led both France and Germany into a dead end. And this argument was formulated by many in the area, one of the most important being Richard Coudenhove-Kalergi, who founded the organization Pan-Europa, Pan-Europe, and also a publication and a journal with that same name. And he was one of the persons who recognized this, writing that out of the terrifying crisis in which Germany and France are locked today, they will either emerge as united Europeans, or they will, biting at each other's throats, bleed to death from their mutually inflicted wounds. There were two lines of development in the interwar period. One saw, or two alternatives. One saw perpetual confrontation, power politics, and antagonisms. The other saw European cooperation and international organization and international law. Coudenhove-Kalergi belonged to the first, for the second of these, stating that it was only through cooperation between the European countries who had been fighting themselves to death in the First World War. It was only through cooperation that Europe, after the First World War, could emerge peacefully and with prosperity. His organization, Pan-Europe, therefore suggested this was one of the first strongest blueprint for European integration. And here you see a map of how Coudenhove-Kalergi conceived of Pan-Europe, 1923, when the organization was founded. And this was an important organization. It included many heads of state from West Europe. It included the leading intellectuals on the liberal social democratic side. It was the progressive message of the era. After the First World War, Europe had emerged weakened and was now squeezed between the emerging superpowers to the west and to the east, the Soviet Union to the east, the United States and its sphere of influence to the west. Pan-Europe was a response to that, and you see here that it would include Europe and what else? The old European colonies, which you see in black here on this map. And Africa was important. It was in fact necessary for this union to come about. Because as Coudenhove-Kalergi understood and argued, Africa could provide Europe with raw materials for its industry, nutrition for its population, land for its overpopulation, labor for its unemployed, and markets for its products. So what he basically suggested was an internationalization and Europeanization of the colonial system. So that France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Britain, and other colonial powers in Europe would bring their colonies under a common management. And in that way, Europe would re-emerge as a geopolitical bloc able to withstand the pressures from both Soviet Union and the United States. So Africa here comes up on the agenda again, because in the same way as Africa intruding into the heart of Europe in the forms of black soldiers had become a problem which made Europeans close ranks, it now returned as a common concern, but this time as a great promise and possibility. The joint development of Africa was an aim so unquestionably good that it was in fact seen as the main reason for European powers to join forces. So this is something for us to contemplate, that in the 1920s, what made Europeans unite was the idea of a common exploitation of the African continent. There were many ideas of this kind, and Coudenhove-Kalergi's was only the most major one. This is a Belgian politician, very influential one in his time, Jules d'Estrées, who wrote about Africa as a European colony and how Europe should found a federal committee for the common management of the African colony and to exploit it and to invest in it and to draw thereby more efficiently on the enormous mineral and agricultural resources of Africa. This is an Italian geopolitical promoter of the Eurafrican idea called Orsini de Camerota. You see the same imaginary here of the world divided into 3 blocks. This is the French Eurafricanist geographer called Eugène Guernier, who wrote a book in 1933 called Africa, Field of European Expansion. This is the German, an image of German engineer Hermann Sörgel, which I will say a little bit more about in a little while. In German, this means gemeinsame Erschließung Afrikas. That means the common exploitation or the common management of Africa. This is a book by Ernst Dietz. Ernst Dix, was geht uns Afrika an? Why does Africa matter to us from 1931? The calculation here was therefore that no European state after the First World War was strong enough and had resources enough to exploit efficiently the African continent. Europe's powers had to pool their resources and join forces. And through this work of joining forces and exploiting the African continent for common common good and for common benefit, Europe would automatically start to cooperate peacefully between the different countries. And so peace would be achieved in Europe as well. This map from Hermann Sörgel, whom I mentioned before, also shows how all these alternatives were perceived. This map too is from 1930, beginning of 1930s, 1932. And here you see it says Zersetzung oder Aufbau. That is to say, fragmentation, disintegration, or construction. And the map of Europe deeply fragmented into different small fiefdoms and countries and internally struggling small political realms, and a large geopolitical bloc underneath. Hermann Sörgel, who was an engineer in Munich in Germany, was one of the most outrageous of these blueprints, because he also proposed how the European and African continents should be joined in a more literal sense, simply by, or not simply, not so simply, but by damming the Mediterranean Sea through a numbers of dams, the largest one being the one across the Gibraltar Sound, where also a large hydroelectric power plants would be built, but also then damming all the large rivers flowing out into the Mediterranean. And by controlling the inflow of water into the Mediterranean, land would then emerge from the bottom of the sea, new land, Neuland, and thereby new territory would be created, but also a number of land bridges that could be used for transportation between Europe and Africa. This was an enormous project which Sörgel launched and tried to get politicians on board to start realize. It would take, according to him, 200 years to sink the sea level of the Mediterranean 200 meters. And during these 100 or 200 years, all Europeans would work together for a common goal of creating what he called Atlantropa. I'm showing you this to help you see the kind of scale of these imaginations of 100 years ago when it came to uniting Europe and Africa. Pan-Europa was Coudenhove-Kalergi's name for this. Atlantropa was Hermann Sergel's name for this. But the name that stuck as a common denominator, as a common kind of, as a common name for them, was Eurafrica. Sergel's plan, I'll just show you some more images from this because they are quite interesting to look at. This is he got help from some of the leading engineers, architects, social planners of Europe at the time, and made very elaborate plans on exactly how to execute Atlantropa or Eurafrica. What we see here is the dam that would unite Spain and Morocco, and thereby also regulate water inflow from the Atlantic to the Mediterranean Sea. Thus, not only creating a bridge between them, but also generate enormous amounts of energy, electricity power. Here's another sketch of that, and here is a cross section. And yes, we can go. And yes, it's interesting also that they also devised plans for, because as you understand, if they would sink the sea floor, all the coastal cities of the Mediterranean, they would end up a few kilometers or even many kilometers from the sea line. So there was also a plan on how to construct new cities, a new Barcelona, a new Genoa, a new Venice, a new Alexandria, and all the coastal cities around the Mediterranean would have to be rebuilt or dammed. And here is a plan for the new Naples. So this was Eurafrica at its most outrageous. It would link firmly together Africa and Europe. It would also create zones for immigration from Europe to Africa. Here is a map by Eugène Garnier. Zones favorable for European populations in Europe. So it's a map that would organize settler colonies in Europe, in Africa, from where white Europeans would settle. Here is the same map from Orsini di Camerota. He makes calculations on how many people each of these areas would be able to receive. The great colonial exposition that took place in Paris just around the same years, because all of these plans were devised, interestingly, precisely at the end of the 1920s and the early 1930s. They were definitely plans very typical of their time, times of enormous political uncertainty, times with the rise of large-scale planning projects, the fascist ones, perhaps the most extraordinary, but also a kind of uncertainty about where geopolitical forces would take Europe and what would happen with its colonial empire. The colonial exposition in Paris in 1931 was another manifestation of this. where in Paris all colonial powers were invited to put their colonies on display. So this was built in eastern Paris, in a park that is still there, and with buildings that still are standing there today. There is an immigration museum where the old anthropological museum that was built at the era stood. But these are postcards from the exhibition where, so to speak, the whole colonial world was brought within the limits of Paris. For Eugène Deschamps, who was the chief and director of the colonial exposition, this was a beacon of colonial optimism in a time when European economy and culture were under severe stress. Paul Reynaud, who was the French Minister of Colonies, he said that the colonial reality calls for a European collaboration for which France stands prepared. And Hubert Lyautey, who was one of the most heroic colonizers and colonial builders of France, he said at the closing session of this exposition that the Holy Alliance of the colonizing people had been formed, a union of all the colonizing nations in a policy of association for the greater moral and material profit of all. So all of this amounts to the following brief statement: that there was a geopolitical calculation here based on two symbiotic benefits. The new geopolitical sphere of a united Europe would be sustainable and prosperous thanks to its incorporation of Africa. And correspondingly, the bonds between once antagonistic European states would be consolidated by the shared goal of developing Africa. Thus, the unification of Europe and a unified European effort to colonize Africa were two processes that presupposed one another. European integration would start in Africa. Europe will be made in Africa. L'Europe se fera en Afrique. But you see, this is a quote from 1955, because these same ideas, they continued from the 30s and were picked up again when Europe again was ruined after 1945. In 1945, Europeans still controlled most parts of the African continent. This is the world in 1945, according to the United Nations. The blue countries are founding nations of the United Nations. The yellow countries are countries who are in the process of becoming members of the United Nations. The red and orange and green countries are territories that are controlled by European powers in one form or another. So when the European integration starts off after the Second World War, our tuition would be that colonialism would be very important. All of these organizations that I list here, the European Movement, the Organization for European Economic Cooperation, NATO, Council of Europe, European Coal and Steel Community, European Defence Community, and European Political Community, and then finally the European Economic Community, founded in 1957. These are the post-war organizations of European integration. And what we have found in our work, and what this book Eurafrica is about, is how all of these organizations, and you see here they were founded in the late 1940s and the early 1950s and all of the work that was done in these organizations led to the foundation of the European Economic Community, today's European Union, in 1957. And for all of them, Africa, or the colonies, was an incredibly important parameter in how they conceived of the reconstruction of Europe after the Second World War. This is OEEC. It is in the interest of the whole free world that the colonial territories which form part of it should endeavor to speed up and increase the production of scarce materials. This is Congress of Europe in The Hague in 1948, which was really the starting conference for West European integration after the Second World War. This is the final declaration of this important Congress. The final declaration was called Message to the Europeans. Together with the overseas people associated with our destinies, that is to say, the colonies, we can tomorrow build the greatest political formation and the greatest economic unit our age has seen. This is the European Union of Federalists, who were kind of the vanguard of European integration in the late 40s and early 1950s. Europe as an entity will be viable only if the links which unite it with countries and dependent territories scattered all over the globe are taken into account. So again, Europe can regenerate and rebuild, only if the dependent territories are taken into account. And this leads us to the Schuman Declaration, which was the start of the European Coal and Steel Community, which was the pre-formation of the European Economic Community. In 1950, he proposed collaboration between West Germany, France, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. They would form the European Coal and Steel Community. Common management of these two vital resources. Schuman was foreign secretary at the time. He was fighting the French Indochina War with hundreds of thousands of dead and a failed war for France. And he, as this war was raging, he proposed the European Coal and Steel Community. But interestingly, one of the important parts of the European Coal and Steel Community was Africa. With increased resources, Europe will be able to pursue the achievement of one of its essential tasks, namely the development of the African continent. And here, I will also quote Paul Reynaud, who I quoted earlier when he was the colonial minister of France. Here, I quote him as the chairman of the Council of Europe's Committee on Economic Questions, the Council of Europe being another of these organizations that tried to make plans for European integration before the EEC, the European Union, was formed. For him too, he stated, we must also, if free Europe is to be made viable, jointly exploit the riches of the African continent and try to find there those raw materials which we are getting from the dollar area and for which we are unable to pay. And then we see the founding of the European Union in 1957. And here I will skip a few slides, but I will show you this poster from 2007. It celebrates 50 years of cooperation between the European Union and the African Union. And it celebrates this in a particular way, because in 2007, when this 50th anniversary was celebrated, a strong point was made that this was not only the 50th anniversary of European integration, starting with the Rome Treaty of 1957. It was also the 50th anniversary of the beginning of independence in Africa, that is to say, decolonization. And here the reference is to Ghana, which was the first African state that became independent, and exactly in the same year, 1957. So this is how the European Union sees this legacy of the EU and independent Africa, and now as a partnership on equal terms. But in the reality, it looked like this. This is from the Rome Treaty negotiations in 1956 that prepared the European Economic Community. Here there was no question about African independence or independent colonies. Rather, the European Economic Community in formation needed the continued control and management of the African colonies. This is an important document from the negotiations by the so-called French and Belgian committee that devised the plans for what then became the association of the European countries, of the African countries to EU. Economically speaking, the European member states of the common market have an essential need for the cooperation and support that the overseas territories, particularly the African ones, are able to offer in order to establish long-term balance of the European economy. The sources of raw material, variegated and abundant, which the overseas territories dispose of, are likely to ensure for the entirety of the European economy of the common market the indispensable foundation for an expanding economy, and present the additional advantage of being situated in countries whose orientation may be influenced by the European countries themselves. It continues, the proposed enterprise entails consequences of major importance for the future of Europe. In aiding Africa and supporting itself on her, the community of the six, that is to say West Germany, France, Italy, Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg, is able to furnish Europe with its equilibrium and a new youth. It is in this perspective that all other elements of information assembled in the present report should be understood. So what is referred to here is that Africa is central to the formation of the EEC, the European Economic Community, or the community of the six. It's even so that Africa provides Europe with equilibrium and a new youth. Africa aids Europe, and Europe supports itself on Africa. And then this is what these negotiations led to. It led to the association of all the Belgian and French colonies to the European Economic Community. Belgium demands the association of the Belgian Congo, of Rwanda, and of Burundi. Italy demands the association of Somalia and wishes to demand that Libya, like Morocco and Tunisia, should be invited to associate. And then it goes on, the Netherlands and France, they associate their respective colonies to the European Economic Community. This is the foundation of the European Union, within which many of us who are here today now live. And on the first page of Le Monde, when this agreement was reached, it says, première étape vers l'Eurafrique, the first step toward Eurafrica. (1957). This is the Schuman Declaration 7 years earlier. And these are some clippings from the time and some books from these 1950s. It shows how the African continent, in the view of the European political and intellectual establishment, was of central concern, and how Europe's future was completely dependent on the continued exploitation of Africa, and how this then went into the construction of the European Union. Exactly how this association was made, I cannot go into here, but what I will end up with a few official quotes. So this is French Prime Minister who visits Washington in 1957, right after these negotiations on Eurafrica have been concluded. I would like to insist upon the unity of Europe. It's now a fact. A few days ago, we jumped over the last hurdles that were on its way, and now an even broader unity is being born. Eurafrica, a close association in which we will work together to promote progress, happiness, and democracy in Africa. And here, Eugène Garnier, I talked about him a bit earlier, from the 1930s. He then, in 1957, he writes, after decades of engagement, the nuptials, that is to say, the matrimony, the wedding of Europe and Africa is finally being completed. Here's a map of the European Economic Community from 1960. This now includes, in pink, dark pink and light pink, all the parts of the European Union, including those who were associated with it. And primarily you see the French and the Belgian colonies. And this map is right on the threshold of independence of these African continents. These are maps of Eurafrica from 1955, 57, and 1960. These are projects for industrial development of Eurafrica from 1959. This is how it was conceived in the world press. The European Economic Community, the foundation of the European Union. What was it? It was a New Deal for the dark continent. It was also a New Deal for the European countries. This is an interesting news item from March 25, 1957, right after the Rome Treaty. It reports about West German engineers from West German industrial delegation going from West Germany to Algeria and France's African colonies to survey the joint development of industrial raw materials required by West Europe. So I will end with this. The basic argument of our book. Africa was of paramount importance in most, if not all, efforts at European integration, from the launching of the Pan-European Union in 1923 to the foundation of the EEC in 1957. Africa was one of the biggest stakes in the Treaty of Rome negotiations 1956-57. The European would not have come into existence at this point in time had it not been conceived as a Euro-African enterprise in which colonialism was Europeanized, which is to say that for France, it was an ultimatum that the French colonies would be part of the European community. Otherwise, France would not have joined. And then, perhaps most important, Eurafrica also had a profound impact on decolonization in Africa. And I will just explain that last conclusion and argument by saying this, that when the African states became independent, and this happened in 59, 1960, 61, and onward, they were already, through this Eurafrican association, part of an economic area that was very attractive to many of the political elites of Africa. So they saw no real reason to break loose from it. It was advantageous for many of these African elites. But it set the African countries now independent in a situation where they were not independent, because they were continued to be under largely European economic management through this association. And this is why decolonization in Africa was really also the start of neo-colonialism. And some of the most radical African leaders, they understood this. Among them, Sékou Touré in Guinea and Kwame Nkrumah in Africa. And they were the brightest analysts of this Eurafrican unity and the foundation of the European Economic Community and Eurafrica. This is Nkrumah in his address to the Ghana National Assembly in 1961. At the moment, neocolonialism is establishing itself among a number of African states. Take, for instance, the European Common Market, which is but the economic and financial arm of neocolonialism and the bastion of European economic imperialism in Africa. The Treaty of Rome, which brought into being the European Common Market, can be compared to the treaty that emanated from the Congress of Berlin in the 19th century. The former treaty established the undisputed sway of colonialism in Africa. The latter marks the advent of neo-colonialism in Africa. So this is how he saw it. But for Europe, this was called Eurafrica, and it actually continues till this day. But I will end here, and then we can continue to think about this, and also to think about what this means for our understanding of migration across the Mediterranean, and how the migration politics and policies in Europe and in the European Union are still devised within this same understanding of the relationship of Europe and Africa, with a mutual dependency between Europe and Africa, which from the European side is clearly seen as one where Europe is the superior partner and Africa is the inferior and receiving one. So thank you for listening, and apologies for going a little bit long, but I hope you found these images and these quotes as fascinating as Pio, my colleague, and I did when we wrote this book. Thanks.